The outbreak of rebellion. Shortly after Satan's inspection, and when the Planetary administration was on the eve of the realization of great things on Urantia, one day, midwinter of the northern continents, Caligastia held a prolonged conference with his associate Dalagastia, after which the latter called the 10 councils of Urantia in session extraordinary. This assembly was opened with the statement that Prince Caligastia was about to proclaim himself absolute sovereign of Urantia, and demanded that all administrative groups abdicate by resigning all of their functions and powers into the hands of Dalagastia as trustee, pending the reorganization of the planetary government and a subsequent redistribution of these offices of administrative authority. The presentation of this astounding demand was followed by the masterly appeal of Van, chairman of the Supreme Council of Coordination. This distinguished administrator and able jurist branded the proposed course of Caligastia as an act bordering on planetary rebellion, and appealed to his conferees to abstain from all participation until an appeal could be taken to Lucifer, the system sovereign of Satania, and he won the support of the entire staff. Accordingly, appeal was taken to Jerusalem, and forthwith came back the orders designating Caligastia as supreme sovereign on Urantia, and commanding absolute and unquestioning allegiance to his mandates. And it was in reply to this amazing message that the noble Van made his memorable address of 7 hours' length, in which he formally drew his indictment of Dalagastia, Caligastia, and Lucifer as standing in contempt of the sovereignty of the universe of Nebadon, and he appealed to the Most Highs of Edentia for support and confirmation. Meantime, the system circuits had been severed. Urantia was isolated. Every group of celestial life on the planet found itself suddenly and without warning isolated, utterly cut off from all outside counsel and advice. Dalagastia formally proclaimed Caligastia God of Urantia and supreme over all. With this proclamation before them, the issues were clearly drawn, and each group drew off by itself and began deliberations, discussions destined eventually to determine the fate of every superhuman personality on the planet. Seraphim and cherubim and other celestial beings were involved in the decisions of this bitter struggle, this long and sinful conflict. Many superhuman groups that chanced to be on Urantia at the time of its isolation were detained here, and, like the seraphim and their associates, were compelled to choose between sin and righteousness, between the ways of Lucifer and the will of the unseen Father. For more than 7 years this struggle continued. Not until every personality concerned had made a final decision would or did the authorities of Edentia interfere or intervene. Not until then did Van and his loyal associates receive vindication and release from their prolonged anxiety and intolerable suspense. 3. The 7 crucial years. The outbreak of rebellion on Jerusalem, the capital of Satania, was broadcast by the Melchizedek Council. The emergency Melchizedeks were immediately dispatched to Jerusalem, and Gabriel volunteered to act as the representative of the Creator Son, whose authority had been challenged. With this broadcast of the fact of rebellion in Satania, the system was isolated, quarantined from her sister systems. There was war in heaven, the headquarters of Satania, and it spread to every planet in the local system. On Urantia, 40 members of the corporeal staff of 100, including Van, refused to join the insurrection. Many of the staff's human assistants, modified and otherwise, were also brave and noble defenders of Michael and his universe government. There was a terrible loss of personalities among seraphim and cherubim. Almost 1/2 of the administrator and transition seraphim assigned to the planet joined their leader and Dalagastia in support of the cause of Lucifer. 40,119 of the primary midway creatures joined hands with Caligastia, but the remainder of these beings remained true to their trust. The traitorous prince marshaled the disloyal Midway creatures and other groups of rebel personalities, and organized them to execute his bidding, while Van assembled the loyal Midwayers and other faithful groups and began the great battle for the salvation of the Planetary staff and other marooned celestial personalities. During the times of this struggle, the Loyalists dwelt in an unwalled and poorly protected settlement a few miles to the east of Dalmatia, but their dwellings were guarded day and night by the alert and ever-watchful loyal Midway creatures, and they had possession of the priceless Tree of Life. Upon the outbreak of rebellion, loyal Cherubim and Seraphim, with the aid of 3 faithful Midwayers, assumed the custody of the Tree of Life, and permitted only the 40 loyalists of the staff and their associated modified mortals to partake of the fruit and leaves of this energy plant. There were 56 of these modified Andonite associates of the staff, 16 of the Andonite attendants of the disloyal staff refusing to go into rebellion with their masters. Throughout the 7 crucial years of the Caligastia rebellion, Van was wholly devoted to the work of ministry to his loyal army of men, Midwayers, and angels. The spiritual insight and moral steadfastness which enabled Van to maintain such an unshakable attitude of loyalty to the universe government was the product of clear thinking, wise reasoning, logical judgment, sincere motivation, unselfish purpose, intelligent loyalty, experiential memory, disciplined character, and the unquestioning dedication of his personality to the doing of the will of the Father in paradise. This 7 years of waiting was a time of heart-searching and soul discipline. Such crises in the affairs of a universe demonstrate the tremendous influence of mind as a factor in spiritual choosing. Education, training, and experience are factors in most of the vital decisions of all evolutionary moral creatures, but it is entirely possible for the indwelling spirit to make direct contact with the decision-determining powers of the human personality, so as to empower the fully consecrated will of the creature to perform amazing acts of loyal devotion to the will and the way of the Father in paradise. And this is just what occurred in the experience of Amadon, the modified human associate of Van. Amadon is the outstanding human hero of the Lucifer Rebellion. This male descendant of Andon and Fanta was one of the 100 who contributed life plasm to the prince's staff, and ever since that event he had been attached to Van as his associate and human assistant. Amadon elected to stand with his chief throughout the long and trying struggle, and it was an inspiring sight to behold this child of the evolutionary races standing unmoved by the sophistries of Dalagastia, while throughout the 7-year struggle he and his loyal associates resisted with unyielding fortitude all of the deceptive teachings of the brilliant Caligastia. Caligastia, with a maximum of intelligence and a vast experience in universe affairs, went astray, embraced sin. Amadon, with a minimum of intelligence and utterly devoid of universe experience, remained steadfast in the service of the universe and in loyalty to his associate. Van utilized both mind and spirit in a magnificent and effective combination of intellectual determination and spiritual insight, thereby achieving an experiential level of personality realization of the highest attainable order. Mind and spirit, when fully united, are potential for the creation of superhuman values, even Urantia realities. There is no end to the recital of the stirring events of these tragic days. But at last the final decision of the last personality was made, and then, but only then, did a Most High of Edentia arrive with the emergency Melchizedeks to seize authority on Urantia. The Caligastia panoramic reign records on Jerusalem were obliterated, and the probationary era of planetary rehabilitation was inaugurated. 6. Van, the Steadfast. The followers of Van early withdrew to the highlands west of India, where they were exempt from attacks by the confused races of the lowlands, and from which place of retirement They planned for the rehabilitation of the world, as their early Badonite predecessors had once all unwittingly worked for the welfare of mankind just before the days of the birth of the Sangik tribes. Before the arrival of the Melchizedek receivers, Van placed the administration of human affairs in the hands of 10 commissions of 4 each, groups identical with those of the prince's regime. The senior resident life carriers assumed temporary leadership of this Council of 40, which functioned throughout the 7 years of waiting. Similar groups of Amadonites assumed these responsibilities when the 39 loyal staff members returned to Jerusalem. These Amadonites were derived from the group of 144 loyal Andonites, to which Amadon belonged, and who have become known by his name. This group comprised 39 men and 105 women. 56 of this number were of immortality status, and all, except Amadon, were translated along with the loyal members of the staff. The remainder of this noble band continued on earth to the end of their mortal days under the leadership of Van and Amadon. They were the biologic leaven, which multiplied and continued to furnish leadership for the world down through the long, dark ages of the post-rebellion era. Van was left on Urantia until the time of Adam, remaining as titular head of all superhuman personalities functioning on the planet. He and Amadon were sustained by the technique of the Tree of Life in conjunction with the specialized life ministry of the Melchizedeks for over 150,000 years. The affairs of Urantia were for a long time administered by a council of planetary receivers, 12 Melchizedeks, confirmed by the mandate of the senior constellation ruler, the Most High Father of Norlashadek. Associated with Melchizedek receivers was an advisory council consisting of 1 of the loyal aides of the fallen prince, the 2 resident life carriers, a trinitized son in apprenticeship training, a volunteer teacher son, a brilliant evening star of Avalon periodically, the chiefs of Seraphim and Cherubim, advisors from 2 neighboring planets, the Director General of Subordinate Angelic Life, and Van, the Commander-in-Chief of the Midway creatures. And thus was Urantia governed and administered until the arrival of Adam. It is not strange that the courageous and loyal Van was assigned a place on the Council of Planetary Receivers, which for so long administered the affairs of Urantia. The 12 Melchizedek receivers of Urantia did heroic work. They preserved the remnants of civilization, and their planetary policies were faithfully executed by Van. Within 1,000 years after the rebellion, he had more than 350 advanced groups scattered abroad in the world. These outposts of civilization consisted largely of the descendants of the loyal Andonites, slightly admixed with the Sangik races, particularly the Blue Men, and with the Nodites. Notwithstanding the terrible setback of rebellion, there were many good strains of biologic promise on Earth. Under the supervision of the Melchizedek receivers, Van and Amadon continued the work of fostering the natural evolution of the human race, carrying forward the physical evolution of man until it reached that culminating attainment which warranted the dispatch of a material son and daughter to Urantia. Van and Amadon remained on Earth until shortly after the arrival of Adam and Eve. Some years thereafter they were translated to Jerusalem, where Van was reunited with his waiting adjuster. Van now serves in behalf of Urantia, while awaiting the order to go forward on the long, long trail to paradise perfection and the unrevealed destiny of the assembling core of mortal finality. It should be recorded that when Van appealed to the Most Highs of Edentia after Lucifer had sustained Caligastia on Urantia, the Constellation Fathers dispatched an immediate decision sustaining Van on every point of his contention. This verdict failed to reach him because the planetary circuits of communication were severed while it was in transit. Only recently was this actual ruling discovered lodged in the possession of a relay energy transmitter, where it had been marooned ever since the isolation of Urantia. Without this discovery, made as the result of the investigations of the Urantia midwayers, the release of this decision would have awaited the restoration of Urantia to the constellation circuits, and this apparent accident of interplanetary communication was possible because energy transmitters can receive and transmit intelligence, but they cannot initiate communication. The technical status of Van on the legal records of Satania was not actually and finally settled until this ruling of the Urantia Fathers was recorded on Jerusalem. The Lucifer Rebellion was withstood by many courageous beings on the various worlds of Satania, but the records of Salvington portray Amadon as the outstanding character of the entire system in his glorious rejection of the flood tides of sedition, and in his unswerving devotion to Van. They stood together unmoved in their loyalty to the supremacy of the invisible Father and his son Michael. At the time of these momentous transactions, I was stationed on Urantia, and I am still conscious of the exhilaration I experienced as I perused the Salvington broadcasts, which told from day to day of the unbelievable steadfastness, the transcendent devotion, and the exquisite loyalty of this one-time semi-savage springing from the experimental and original stock of the Andonic race. From Urantia up through Salvington and even on to Uversa, for 7 long years the first inquiry of all subordinate celestial life regarding the Satania Rebellion ever and always was, what of Amadon of Urantia? Does he still stand unmoved? If the Lucifer Rebellion has handicapped the local system and its fallen worlds, if the loss of this son and his misled associates has temporarily hampered the progress of the constellation of Norlashadek, then weigh the effect of the far-flung presentation of the inspiring performance of this one child of nature and his determined band of 143 comrades in standing steadfast for the higher concepts of universe management and administration, in the face of such tremendous and adverse pressure exerted by his disloyal superiors. And let me assure you, this has already done more good in the universe of Nebadon and the super-universe of Arvantan than can ever be outweighed by the sum total of all the evil and sorrow of the Lucifer Rebellion. And all this is a beautifully touching and superbly magnificent illumination of the wisdom of the Father's universal plan for mobilizing the core of mortal finality on Paradise, and for recruiting this vast group of mysterious servants of the future, largely from the common clay of the mortals of ascending progression. Just such mortals as the impregnable Amadon. Presented by a Melchizedek of Nebadon.
2. Planning for the Garden. For almost 100 years prior to Tabamancha's inspection, Van and his associates from their Highland headquarters of world ethics and culture had been preaching the advent of a promised Son of God, a racial uplifter, a teacher of truth, and the worthy successor of the traitorous Caligastia. Though the majority of the world's inhabitants of those days exhibited little or no interest in such a prediction, those who were in immediate contact with Van and Amadon took such teaching seriously and began to plan for the actual reception of the promised son. Van told his nearest associates the story of the material sons on Jerusalem, what he had known of them before ever he came to Urantia. He well knew that these Adamic sons always lived in simple but charming garden homes, and proposed, 83 years before the arrival of Adam and Eve, that they devote themselves to the proclamation of their advent and to the preparation of a garden home for their reception. From their Highland headquarters and from 61 far-scattered settlements, Van and Amadon recruited a corps of over 3,000 willing and enthusiastic workers who, in solemn assembly, dedicated themselves to this mission of preparing for the promised, at least expected, son. Van divided his volunteers into 100 companies with a captain over each, and an associate who served on his personal staff as a liaison officer, keeping Amadon as his own associate. These commissions all began in earnest their preliminary work, and the Committee on Location for the Garden sallied forth in search of the ideal spot. Although Caligastia and Dalagastia had been deprived of much of their power for evil, They did everything possible to frustrate and hamper the work of preparing the garden. But their evil machinations were largely offset by the faithful activities of the almost 10,000 loyal Midway creatures who so tirelessly labored to advance the enterprise. 3. The garden site. The Committee on Location was absent for almost 3 years. It reported favorably concerning 3 possible locations. The first was an island in the Persian Gulf. The second, the river location subsequently occupied as the second garden. The third, a long, narrow peninsula, almost an island, projecting westward from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The committee almost unanimously favored the third selection. This site was chosen, and 2 years were occupied in transferring the world's cultural headquarters, including the Tree of Life, to this Mediterranean peninsula. All but a single group of the peninsula dwellers peaceably vacated when Van and his company arrived. This Mediterranean peninsula had a salubrious climate and an equable temperature. This stabilized weather was due to the encircling mountains and to the fact that this area was virtually an island in an inland sea. While it rained copiously on the surrounding highlands, it seldom rained in Eden proper. But each night, from the extensive network of artificial irrigation channels, a mist would go up to refresh the vegetation of the garden. The coastline of this land mass was considerably elevated, and the neck connecting with the mainland was only 27 miles wide at the narrowest point. The great river that watered the garden came down from the higher lands of the peninsula and flowed east through the peninsular neck to the mainland, and thence across the lowlands of Mesopotamia to the sea beyond. It was fed by 4 tributaries which took origin in the coastal hills of the Edenic Peninsula, and these are the 4 heads of the river which went out of Eden, and which later became confused with the branches of the rivers surrounding the second garden. The mountains surrounding the garden abounded in precious stones and metals, though these received very little attention. The dominant idea was to be the glorification of horticulture and the exaltation of agriculture. The site chosen for the garden was probably the most beautiful spot of its kind in all the world, and the climate was then ideal. Nowhere else was there a location which could have lent itself so perfectly to becoming such a paradise of botanic expression. In this rendezvous, the cream of the civilization of Urantia was foregathering. Without and beyond, the world lay in darkness, ignorance, and savagery. Eden was the one bright spot on Urantia. It was naturally a dream of loveliness, and it soon became a poem of exquisite and perfected landscape glory. Paper 74. Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve arrived on Urantia from the year A.D. 1934, 37,848 years ago. It was in mid-season, when the garden was in the height of bloom, that they arrived. At high noon and unannounced, the 2 seraphic transports, accompanied by the Jerusalem personnel entrusted with the transportation of the biologic uplifters to Urantia, settled slowly to the surface of the revolving planet in the vicinity of the temple of the Universal Father. All the work of rematerializing the bodies of Adam and Eve was carried on within the precincts of this newly created shrine, and from the time of their arrival, 10 days passed before they were recreated in dual human form for presentation as the world's new rulers. They regained consciousness simultaneously. The material sons and daughters always serve together. It is the essence of their service at all times and in all places, never to be separated. They are designed to work in pairs. Seldom do they function alone. 1. Adam and Eve on Jerusalem. The planetary Adam and Eve of Urantia were members of the senior corps of material sons on Jerusalem, being jointly number 14,311. They belonged to the 3rd physical series and were a little more than 8 feet in height. At the time Adam was chosen to come to Urantia, he was employed, with his mate, in the trial and testing physical laboratories of Jerusalem. For more than 15,000 years, they had been directors of the division of experimental energy, as applied to the modification of living forms. Long before this, they had been teachers in the citizenship schools for new arrivals on Jerusalem. And all this should be borne in mind in connection with the narration of their subsequent conduct on Urantia. When the proclamation was issued calling for volunteers for the mission of Adamic adventure on Urantia, the entire senior corps of material sons and daughters volunteered. The Melchizedek examiners, with the approval of Lanaforge and the Most Highs of Edentia, finally selected the Adam and Eve who subsequently came to function as the biologic uplifters of Urantia. Adam and Eve had remained loyal to Michael during the Lucifer Rebellion. Nevertheless, the pair were called before the system's sovereign and his entire cabinet for examination and instruction. The details of Urantia affairs were fully presented. They were exhaustively instructed as to the plans to be pursued in accepting the responsibilities of rulership on such a strife-torn world. They were put under joint oaths of allegiance to the Most Highs of Edentia and to Michael of Salvington, and they were duly advised to regard themselves as subject to the Urantia Corps of Melchizedek receivers until that governing body should see fit to relinquish rule on the world of their assignment. This Jerusalem pair left behind them on the capital of Satania and elsewhere 100 offspring, 50 sons and 50 daughters, magnificent creatures who had escaped the pitfalls of progression and who were all in commission as faithful stewards of universe trust at the time of their parents' departure for Urantia. And they were all present in the beautiful temple of the material sons, attendant upon the farewell exercises associated with the last ceremonies of the bestowal acceptance. These children accompanied their parents to the dematerialization headquarters of their order, and were the last to bid them farewell and divine speed as they fell asleep in the personality lapse of consciousness which precedes the preparation for seraphic transport. The children spent some time together at the family rendezvous, rejoicing that their parents were soon to become the visible heads, in reality the sole rulers, of planet 606 in the system of Satania. And thus did Adam and Eve leave Jerusalem amidst the acclaim and well-wishing of its citizens. They went forth to their new responsibilities adequately equipped and fully instructed concerning every duty and danger to be encountered on Urantia. 2. Arrival of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve fell asleep on Jerusalem, and when they awakened in the Father's temple on Urantia in the presence of the mighty throng assembled to welcome them, they were face to face with two beings of whom they had heard much, Van and his faithful associate Amadon. These two heroes of the Caligastia secession were the first to welcome them in their new garden home. The tongue of Eden was an Andonic dialect as spoken by Amadon. Van and Amadon had markedly improved this language by creating a new alphabet of 24 letters, and they had hoped to see it become the tongue of Urantia as the Edenic culture would spread throughout the world. Adam and Eve had fully mastered this human dialect before they departed from Jerusalem, so that this son of Andon heard the exalted ruler of his world address him in his own tongue. And on that day there was great excitement and joy throughout Eden, as the runners went in great haste to the rendezvous of the carrier pigeons assembled from near and far, shouting, "Let loose the birds! Let them carry the word that the promised Son has come!" Hundreds of believer settlements had faithfully, year after year, kept up the supply of these home-reared pigeons for just such an occasion. As the news of Adam's arrival spread abroad, thousands of the nearby tribesmen accepted the teachings of Van and Amadon, while for months and months pilgrims continued to pour into Eden to welcome Adam and Eve and to do homage to their unseen Father. Soon after their awakening, Adam and Eve were escorted to the formal reception on the great mound to the north of the temple. This natural hill had been enlarged and made ready for the installation of the world's new rulers. Here, at noon, the Urantia Reception Committee welcomed this son and daughter of the system of Satania. Amadon was chairman of this committee, which consisted of 12 members, embracing a representative of each of the 6 Sangic races, the acting chief of the Midwayers, Anan, a loyal daughter and spokesman for the Nodites, Noah, the son of the architect and builder of the garden and executive of his deceased father's plans, and the 2 resident life carriers. The next act was the delivery of the charge of planetary custody to Adam and Eve by the senior Melchizedek, chief of the Council of Receivership on Urantia. The material son and daughter took the oath of allegiance to the Most Highs of Norlashadek and to Michael of Nebadon, and were proclaimed rulers of Urantia by Van, who thereby relinquished the titular authority which for over 150,000 years he had held by virtue of the action of the Melchizedek receivers. And Adam and Eve were invested with kingly robes on this occasion, the time of their formal induction into world rulership. Not all of the arts of Dalmatia had been lost to the world. Weaving was still practiced in the days of Eden. Then was heard the archangel's proclamation, and the broadcast voice of Gabriel decreed the second judgment roll call of Urantia and the resurrection of the sleeping survivors of the second dispensation of grace and mercy on 606 of Satania. The dispensation of the prince has passed. The age of Adam, the third planetary epoch, opens amidst scenes of simple grandeur, and the new rulers of Urantia start their reign under seemingly favorable conditions, notwithstanding the worldwide confusion occasioned by lack of the cooperation of their predecessor in authority on the planet.